Okay, hi everyone. It's Sacred Thing. We're going to read chapter 3. I think we're on chapter 3. All right. Okay, chapter 3. Maya awoke most mornings surprised to find herself still alive when so many she loved were dead. Often they visited her in the early morning as the sun's rays filtered through the upper bay window where her bed nestled. She'd always loved being awakened by the sun. Many years ago, she made herself curtains, beautiful curtains, balloon shades with raw silk dyed turquoise and trimmed with French lace. They disintegrated and she never replaced them. She no longer feared exposure. From her bed, Maya could look through the south-facing bay of her window when the trees were bare and see the green winter slopes of Ritual Hill. If her door were open, she could look down the long hallway through the glass door of the kitchen and out the back window to the rising curve of Twin Peaks, Los Pechos. Maybe it's Los Pecos in Spanish. The young ones called them the breasts, breasts of the Virgin, breasts of the goddess, depending on your persuasion. It didn't matter to her. The goddess always was a virgin, complete in herself, unmated. She had been a virgin herself once, but then she met Rio. You were not a virgin when you met me. I remember it clearly. You were quite experienced. Suddenly he was there, sitting on the edge of her bed, blond and bearded and sexy in his tight faded jeans, like he was when he was 19 years old. You're blocking the view, you old crow, she said to him. Move over, where you've been the last couple of weeks. Places, but don't change the subject. We were discussing your unlamented virginity, which, as I recall, you'd unburdened yourself of at 15 or so. I'm not talking about my hymen. I'm talking about my state of being. I allowed you to mate me. Was that so bad? Well, it had its moments, good and bad. The best and the worst, Rio said. You know I never do things halfway. Once I would have said it took years off my life, but I guess I can't complain on that score. Pure luck, Johanna said. She made a fairly substantial ghost, sitting next to Rio on the side of Maya's bed, her molasses-dark skin gleaming in the warm light, her washed silk shirt glowing in soft shades of green, but no weight depressed the bedclothes and the mattress. Happenstance, not for any great virtue the rest of us don't possess. What are you talking about? You, why you're still alive and the rest of us are dead. Jealous? Johanna snorted, a sound characteristic of her life. Not of you, girlfriend. There are a few pleasures and that compensate for the discomforts and petty humiliations of corporeality, but I'm afraid you are long past them. Don't count on that, and watch out. Dwell too much on the pleasures of the flesh, and you'll find yourself reincarnating. I intend to, at the earliest opportunity, in your line, if not my own. My line seems to have faded out. Don't give up on Bird yet, Rio said. Why not? Do you know something I don't know? The dead are forbidden to tell all we know, Johanna informed her. The dead are forbidden to tell all we know, Johanna informed her. Oh, screw you, Maya said, but her tone was affectionate. That, I'm afraid, is no longer possible between us. Johanna smiled, tilting her head down to look up from the underraised brows, a seductive gesture Maya remembered well. But you wait. Someday we'll both be back in young, nubile bodies again, and it'll be like it was the first time when we got stoned. all that acid and ended up surprising ourselves on the locker room floor, not to mention those two gym teachers who found us. Even dead, you're incorrigible. I am a daughter of the river, Oshun, the goddess of love. Maya turned back to Rio. Do you or do you not know anything about Bird? Can't say. Well, I'm not sure I want either of you in my line anyway. Why not? Didn't I act as a perfect father to your kid? You were a great father to every kid except your own. And whose fault was that? If you or Johanna had told me she existed, I would have fathered her too. Never mind that, Maya said. I'm not quarreling with your talent for paternity. The point is, as a son, you were hell on wheels. Do you think I want to inflict that on my descendants? Wait for Madrone to breed. You and Johanna both. She's your granddaughter. Not that she has any plans in that direction now. Not since Sandy died. My line doesn't plan these things, Johanna said. We have fortuitous accidents. Like the fortuitous accident you had after carrying on with Mr. Superstud here. Maya kicked her foot toward Rio's ghost, who was, I remind you, my boyfriend at the time. That was no accident. That was an ancestor knocking at the door, wanting to be Rachel. Johanna stretched, yawned, and winked. Maybe accident isn't the operative term here. Maybe I'd better just say that my line is susceptible to intervention from the dead. Otherwise, how do you explain Rachel herself, a 50-year-old medical doctor, no doubt acquainted with the facts of life, getting knocked up by a 26-year-old in the Guadalupe Liberation Front? She was following the bad example of her elders. Speak for yourself, girlfriend. I was quite youthful when I had Bridget in my mid-40s, and I would have had her by you, she turned to Rio, if you hadn't had that vasectomy in prison. You were practically menopausal, Johanna said, but that's beside the point, which is that Rachel's little dalliance gave us Madrone, and your fling with, what's his name? Carlos. Right, anyway, he gave you Bridget, and through her, Marley, rest his soul, and Bird, and without them, all the odds would be even worse. The odds of what? The odds that our next lifetime will be restful, pleasurable, tropical, idle, that I am in the process of planning instead of a miserable, starved sojourn in some millennialist-infested breeding pen. Our next lifetime? You, me, and Rio, our little karmic trio. That rhymes, did you notice? Maya looked at Johanna with suspicion. For just a moment she seemed to have a sheaf of colored brochures in her hand, as if she'd come from some astral travel agency. Were there agents in the afterlife who could get you special deals on accommodations in the next? Did they offer group rates? How can you be making plans for the next life, Maya said, when I'm still in the middle of this one? I'd say tail end, not middle, Johanna countered. You're winding down. I'm not dead yet. Anyway, haven't we stored up enough karmic good points in this life to have assured some comfort in the next? That is exactly what nobody seems to grasp about this karma business. It's not a simple matter of cause and effects, reward and punishment. It's a question of what's available. You see, as long as life for the majority of the souls on this planet is just a long round of starvation, misery, torture, and early death, and believe me, outside this fortunate watershed that is an apt description of the state of affairs. As long as only a few live in comfort while the masses scrape along in want, then all of us returning souls have to take our fair share of shifts among the hungry. You think this life you've lived was tough? Let me tell you, it was just R&R between the ones where you never get a solid meal 2 days running or die before your first birthday from drinking bad water. Johanna, you're not cheering me up. I didn't come to cheer you up. I came to warn you. This next year is a pivotal time, one of those hinges that open or close doors of fate. Watch out. What do you mean? Maya asked. She sat up and opened her eyes, but the room was empty. Madrone quietly pushed open the door and entered Maya's room, bearing a very old tray commemorating the marriage of Prince Charles to Lady Diana's back in the century. Upon it rested two of Maya's favorite Chinese cups, eggshell thin, grass green, with a pattern of butterflies on them, and brown chipped teapot. Maya observed her closely. She looked rested, but there was still a pale undertone to the hue of her warm skin that spoke of deep fatigue. "How are you this morning?" Madrone asked. "I'm still alive. What do you think of that?" "I'm glad somebody is," Madrone said, carefully placing the tray and settling herself on the edge of the bed. "You've been talking to the dead again?" "How can you tell?" "A certain faraway look you get in your eye, a little cloudy, like cataracts." Madrone smiled and handed Maya her tea. "And a good news from the other side." "The dead are annoyingly cryptic." "They're probably swamped with new arrivals." Maya sipped her tea. It was the herb they called mystery mint, from some spontaneous miscongregation of peppermint and spearmint in the Black Dragon garden. She wished it were good old caffeinated black tea, Twining's English breakfast. That's what she used to like, with a little milk. Speaking of tea, I have some. I'm going to take a little sipperoo. I'm drinking exotic chai. Maya sipped her tea. It was the herb they called mystery mint, from some... Okay, I read that. That was what she used to like, with a little milk. They never saw that anymore. She had outlasted Twinings too, or maybe it still existed out in some corner of that vast world they no longer moved in. Maybe, in some air-filtered, sunless enclave. The stewards drank it every day. "You're really worried about this new disease, aren't you?" Maya observed. Madrone swirled the tea in her cup as if looking for her fate in the dregs. Her voice was soft, controlled, but Maya could hear the pain concealed in it. "It just hit me again. About Consuelo." "How did it happen?" Her fever spiked up suddenly, triggered premature labor. "She was fine the day before. There was nothing to indicate a problem. No fetal distress, no signs of toxemia. Just that odd low-grade temperature and the slight headache, like Sandy had before he fell off the roof." "You think he fell because of the fever?" "I know he did. I could feel it. This, whatever it is, like a presence of his in his blood, a certain color in his aura. I can feel it, but I can't see it or get a hold of it. We don't know what it is or how it's spreading or what to expect. I'm afraid, Madrina." What to say, Maya wondered. Wasn't she supposed to be old and wise and comforting? When did this highly touted wisdom suddenly descend? Was it like tongues of fire, or the holy dove of the Christians? Would she ever feel its claws digging into her scalp? "I wish I could help you," she said at last. "You carry too many burdens for somebody your age." "I'm 28, almost mature, a baby, a mere child, barely out of diapers, far too young to do what you do. Why, the curandera who tried to train me in Mexico wasn't allowed to heal anyone except herself until she was 30, and she couldn't work on anyone outside her family until she was 40. That sounds luxuriously sane," Madrone admitted, "but we don't live in sane times. At any rate, you need some time off, or at least some stimulation besides the company of the crotchety old woman. Have you heard from Sage and Nita and Holy Bear? When are they coming back?" "Not for another few weeks." "They should be down here with you. This house is empty without them," Madrone said. "You should be more appreciative in their effort." "How do I appreciate 57 new breeds of waterborne bacteria? Bacteria that can neutralize toxins might mean that our descendants could eat shellfish out of a bay again someday, if any of us survive, which I'm beginning to think is less and less likely." "Everyone's so gloomy today," Maya complained. "Even the ghosts are intimating doom." Madrone smiled. "Isn't that the ghost's prerogative?" "Maybe, but it worries me to see you so down in the mouth. I just feel bad about Consuelo, about Sandy, about everybody. I feel like I failed them all." Maya patted her arm. There was nothing to say, really. She herself still felt bad about everyone she had known who died, from Sandy back to Cameron Graham Rosenthal, who died of AIDS downstairs 60 years ago when the house was still divided into separate flats. Yes, she missed him from time to time, missed dressing up with him and strolling through the Castro, making private comments about all the beautiful young men they'd passed. She'd been living off Johanna's charity then, just back from Mexico, trying to write. And the beautiful young men had not yet wasted to living skeletons, to die blotched with lesions, gasping for breath. I wish I could help you, Maya said. You do, Madrina. You help a lot. Madrone closed her eyes. Really, she could almost sink back into a trance here in the sun with Maya's hand to soothe her. When you're tired enough, Madrone thought, the chi worlds are just an eye blink, a breath away, like yesterday, watching beside Consuelo's closed coffin, surrounded by lighted candles in the sisters' living room. Rosa sat, looking solemn, almost hidden behind a huge bouquet of calla lilies. I'm sorry, Madrone had said to her. I'm so sorry. It's not your fault, Rosa had said, with tears pooling at the bottom of her eyes. Not my fault, but my inadequacy, Madrone said to herself, settling down to keep vigil. She had focused on the coffin, letting herself sink into the searching trance, moving down through the wood of the box until she could see with her inner eye the body shaped by light, its energy from already starting to come apart. Traces of Consuelo's spirit, shreds of personality, lingered like wisps of scent. Madrone sniffed emotion, anger, outrage, a sense of being cheated, the aggrieved surprise of the unexpectedly dead. She felt sweat on her face and willed herself to breathe deeper, to sink down further. This was the worst level, and she could only get through it by saying over and over again, not mine, not my pain, not my grief. Down, and yes, there was something else, that elusive something she had felt after Sandy died, but what was it? Could a microbe have personality, or was she just anthropomorphizing? What? If only she could see whatever it was, grab hold of it, learn how it spread and how to defeat it. She could track it, patient as any hunter, but what was there to scent but elusive traces of the air, shifting in energy? Not a flu virus, or not something patterned like the old HIV series, or a spirochete like syphilis or Lyme disease. They each had their characteristic signature in the energy realms, and she could recognize them as easily as she could identify mugworts or comfrey in an overgrown garden. No, this was something else, and she was beginning to recognize its feel, but she still couldn't see it, only follow, down and down. Where are you drifting to? Maya said sharply. Madrone, come back. Maya's hand gripped her arm sharply and brought her back with a jerk. She felt a sharp sense of vertigo and fought down nausea. Diosa, Maya, don't do that to me. I called your name 3 times. Really? I didn't know I went so far down. You shouldn't trance like that, unprotected, ungrounded. You didn't even cast a circle. I didn't mean to trance. I was just thinking about Consuelo again and the virus. Oh, all right. I guess I was starting to search for it. You be careful. You're becoming obsessed with the thing. An obsession opens the door to the bad reality. Did I ever explain the old curandera's theory to you? Madrone smiled. At least a dozen times. Well, I'd better explain it again, because you don't seem to get it. Donna Elena used to say that there was a good reality, or el mundo bueno, literally a good world, and a bad reality, el mundo malo, and they were always vying with each other. The good reality, you have a mild headache, and the bad reality, you have a fatal brain disease. In the good reality, you catch hold of the rail as your foot slips. In the bad reality, you miss, slide down the stairs, and break your neck. We walk in the good reality as if we're treading the thin skin on the warm milk. It's always possible to break through and drown. When you take a foolish risk, especially in magical work, as you just did, it's like sticking out your tongue at fate, daring the bad reality to suck you down. And they say, El mundo malo never passes up a dare. Who says? They, you know, the amorphosis ubiquitous. They. Ignore their advice at your peril. I always listen to your advice, Madrina. I just don't always take it. There is a hopeful side of Dona Elena's teaching, Maya went on. Even in the El Mundo Malo, the good reality is always just on the other side of the surface of things. If you can learn to reach and pull yourself through, you can make miracles. I'll bear that in mind, Madrone said, as more and more miracles seemed to be called for. She stood up and placed her teacup back on the tray. Have you finished your tea? No, I've been talking to you. Leave it with me. I'll wash the cups later. And have you had any breakfast yet? Are you hungry? I'll get you something, Madrone offered. No, I want you to eat. I'm fine. I will when I'm hungry. Go back to sleep. Get some rest. You're worn out. I will. Madrone leaned over and kissed Maya's cheek. But later. Today's my day to represent the healers at the council, and I'm already late. The doomed council hall nestled between the two hills of Twin Peaks. That was page 44. Madrone hurried out of the gondola that had brought her up the hill and dashed down the steps of the tower 2 by 2. The session was already underway as she entered the hall through the gate of air in the east. The council was open to everyone, but each neighbor and each work collective picked spokespeople who attended one day each week as gift work. All the healers took turns, so each was required to devote only a day every month to 2 meetings. Some guilds picked representatives who served for a fixed term, providing continuity, but no healer could be spread for weeks or months. In the 4 corners of the room were stationed the voices who spoke in trance for 4 sacred things. In the north direction of Earth, the first of the voices were the mask of the white deer, the sacred fallow deer that roamed Point Reyes Peninsula and the slopes of Tamalpais. The bearer of the hawk mask, with its curved, sharp beak, guardian of the creature of the air, sat in the east. Coyote, wearing a wooden mask painted with dots and stripes of brilliant color, sat in the south as the trickster guardian of fire, of the energy of brilliant color, sat in the south, I already said that one, of the energy systems. In the west, in a mask with gleaming scales and geometric designs of the red and black, sat Salmon, guardian of the waters, symbols of return and regeneration and hope. Long ago, the bay of the streams that flowed through the city had been the southern boundary of salmon country, receiving their yearly run of fish, returning to spawn and die. But the pink salmon, the California salmon, and the great ocean-going steelhead trout no longer returned to the toxic bay. The great dream of the Water Council and the Toxic Council was to restore the salmon run. Holy Bear always said he would know their work was successful when he could sit on his front porch and fish. Although in point of fact, Nita would interject by the time the fish made their way to their neighborhood. They'd be ready to drop their eggs and rot, and regularly spawning runs through the city's streams might be a mixed blessing. Among them walked the speaker for the voices, who was always either a man dressed as a woman or a woman dressed as a man. Today the speaker was a tall, muscular man who wore a beautiful embroidered Japanese kimono and silver bracelets that chimed like bells whenever he moved. The room was circular, it lit by skylights and warmed by fire in the central hearth. The 4 voices each had a low pillow-covered platform to sit on in their appropriate direction. Everyone else sat in a rough circle on an assortment of pillows, chairs, and battered old couches. Council would eventually replace them with beautiful cushions and fine crafted seats, as they had gradually recycled the old scraps of carpeting that once covered the floor and laid down rugs that were works of art, woven of hand-spun wool, with soft but vibrant colors and intricate patterns of the sacred symbols, the quartered circle and the double spiral in the center. The voices gave an aura of ceremony to what otherwise a fairly informal gathering. As she made her way to a seat, Madrone felt their power flowing through the room. A chat began singing itself inside her head. When we are all gone, they will remain. Wind and rock, fire and rain. They will remain when we return. The wind will blow and the fire will burn. She looked into the eyes of Coyote, painted spirals that seemed to draw her in and in. Maybe she was falling into trance herself. The humans around her seemed ephemeral, inconsequential, while the masked figures became eternal. And yet she could clearly remember the meeting when they established the voices. It was only about 5 years before. She had been devoted attender of meetings at that time, a stage everyone had to go through. Maya claimed. There was criticism of the meetings. They were too long, too heady. People left feeling drained and ungrounded. Of course, that was the nature of meetings, someone pointed out. But weren't we here to transform things? Someone else asked. Somehow the question got around to the representation of the four sacred things. Many people that felt that nothing could truly be decided when the four sacred things were not present. The animals, the plants, the waters had no voice in council, and yet every decision should take them into account. After seemingly interminable argument, they had one of the unlooked for bursts of collective creativity, or perhaps madness, and established this ritual where masked representatives for each of the sacred elements sat in trance in council, channeling the voices of wind, fire, water, and earth. May the balance be restored, she murmured as she sat herself, because that was the appropriate thing to say in the presence of any manifestation of the four sacred things, or when entering or leaving a sacred space. She said it under her breath. May the balance be restored, so as not to interrupt anything. She slid onto a couch beside a short-haired, bony brown woman with the muscles of a construction worker. The woman winked at her. I'm Surya, she said, Carpenter's Guild, Madrone of the Healers. She murmured back, feeling a little thread of attraction that she was far too tired to pursue. She was sinking into trance, and that was not appropriate for council meeting. But as she looked around the room, all she could see were energies, earth and air and fire and water, congealing into bone and breath, and nerve and blood, emerging into form and fading back into formlessness. They played through the colors of light coming through the skylights and through the forms carved into the beams and the lintels of the doorways. They played through the genetic bequests of the ancestors. She saw reflected in the skin, colors, and bone structures and textures of hair around her. East, south, west, and north. Europe, Africa, Asia, the islands, the Americas, all the waters of the world had flowed over the spirit-haunted land, leaving something washed ashore in their wake. Ivory, sepia, raw umber, burnt umber, ebony, charcoal, cinia, a palette of earth tones, like colors out of a paint box, auspicious, they called it, when children of ancestors from all four directions sat together and the circle was whole. About 50 people were present, finishing up a discussion about reconciling the solar and lunar calendars, a topic about which Madrone had nothing to say. Salal, who was a crow of the meeting for the day, nodded at Madrone to show that she was aware of her entrance. Saul was one of the most skilled facilitators, and Madrone was glad to see her there, looking calm and composed, as she always did, graceful in her cross-legged posture, her hair dyed a shocking red, rising from her head in flame-like peaks, her dark eyes darting around the room, reading the mood of the group. Salal was not easily intimidated or confused, and she was unshakable under pressure. I will just close my eyes for a moment to rest them, Madrone told herself. The buzz of the voices and the flying hands of the speakers simultaneously translating their words into sign were hypnotic. Although the main discussion was in English, side conversations went on around the edges of the room in Spanish, Mandarin, Arabic, Cantonese, Tagalog. Every neighborhood in the city acclaimed a mother tongue of its own to cultivate. With global transportation systems broke down, and the stewards still jamming the airwaves after 20 years. Who knew these days what survived in Canton or Cairo or Manila or Mexico? The city's neighborhoods might as well be the last preserves of their languages and cultures. Lulled by the voices, Madrone of dreamed the domed hall as the four-chamber heart of the city, where she could rest, feeling its pulse, taking the measure of its beat, listening for what swam hidden in the secret veins. The spirochetti, the parasite, the virus. Oh, it was deceptive. This strength, this vigor. But she could hear what whined below, like one small mosquito in a large room when you were trying to sleep. Madrone, the sound of her name jolted her into wakefulness. She opened her eyes. Salah was looking at her expectantly. Can you give us a report from the Healers' Council? What's happening with this latest epidemic? How dangerous is it? Madrone rose to speak. She looked around the room at eyes of every shape and color, all focused on her. That was what she did sometimes when she had to look into the mother's eyes and tell her child would not live. She would focus on the shape and the color of the iris and the way the lid curved over the surface and the way the lashes were set into the lid, eye after eye, each one a small cauldron, container of water, a vessel, a lens. It's bad, very bad, Madrone spoke, as they all did when addressing council in English augmented with sign. It begins as a low-grade fever, like a mild flu. Headache, muscle aches, congestion. In a small percentage of the patients, that's all it is, and after a week or so they recover. But most go through a crisis where the fever shoots up suddenly, high enough to cause brain damage or death, especially in children. And for pregnant women, it's disastrous. The high fever triggers labor prematurely and can seriously damage the fetus if it survives. These were the facts laid out for them, but she felt compelled to add more. We've dealt with a lot of diseases over the last 10 years, one epidemic after another, if not on quite the same cycle as 38, but this one scares me. She found, as she always, that her spoken words could lie with their intonation, with the flat control of her delivery, but her fingers could not conceal her emotions. I won't pretend it doesn't. It's the worst thing we've had to deal with in a decade. Then there was silence. If Madrone was scared, they knew it was bad. Usually they counted on her for reassurance. You tried to identify the cause? Sal asked. We suspect another mutant virus, but we really don't know yet. None of our antivirals work against it, or any of our other drugs. Silence again. Shouldn't we evacuate the pregnant women? Someone asked. Where to? Madrone said. The damn thing appeared upriver almost as soon as it did down here. What do you suggest we do? What she wanted to say was, do anything you ever wanted to do and haven't done. Now, quick, while you still can. Eat the berries and ripe off the vines. Get your caged birds free. But she couldn't say that. Ghost eyes looked at her, her hands upraised in a gesture of helplessness, were all the answers she could give. But for the benefit of the blind, she added, I don't know what kind of support do the healers need from the council. What kind of support do the healers need from the council? Saul asked. A miraculous appearance of the Virgin, a bleeding statue with healing powers, a curandera with herbs known only to the Indians, a wonder drug. We're okay, I guess, Madrone said. We could use someone else at the hospital to help with herbal preparations now that Sandy's gone. I'll find someone, a woman spoke up. What about personal support? Asked Sura at Madrone's side. You look done in. Every healer... Oh, wait. I'm just tired, not enough sleep. But that's what you sign up on when you become a midwife. Every healer I know looks about the same, the young man said. Maybe we can't offer a miracle cure, but we could at least take some of the load off other work off you. Your gardens, your households. Madrone opened... Why is this making me so sad? Madrone opened her mouth to protest, but considering the state of Black Dragon's house, the weeds in the garden, and the 100 chores she hadn't gotten around to since Sandy died, she shut it again. A woman in a yellow headcloth whom Madrone recognized from the Central Market spoke. And not just the healers, the sick need help too, and their households. I don't know about you all, but coming in this morning I noticed a fair number of raggedy-ass gardens. We should be organizing in the neighborhoods to take care of people better. I'm put my sweater on. It's cold in here. Mm. Mm. Okay. If this becomes a full-scale epidemic, we're going to really need organization, said one of the men from the ferries, the gay men's enclave in the center of the city. Let's think about that, Salal said. Let's not shove it into the back of our minds because we don't want to face the possibility. Who has ideas about what to do? I think everyone in every work group should have a backup. Everyone who has an essential skill or piece of information should share it with at least 3 others. Every household should have 2 sister households to share in the workload if necessary, a pale blonde woman said. There was a general murmur of agreement. Are there concerns? Salal asked. Yeah, are people going to panic about this? It depends how we put it out. It doesn't have to come down to a directive of doom. Most of these things we're suggesting are just common sense. We should do them even if there wasn't an epidemic. Anyone can die at any time, but the work needs to go on. We have done some of them, at least in the transport collective we do. Every tower maintenance team has a backup. Every coordinator has 2 helpers who share all vital information and rotate into the position in turn. I thought every work group was organized this way. Toxics, more or less. They had moved into problem-solving mode, and Madrone felt her attention beginning to drift away. They were good, these people. She trusted them. If there was any best way to handle this crisis, they would find it. If there was anything to be done, they would do it. And maybe just for 5 minutes, she could rest her eyes. The speaker began to pound his staff on the floor, the sign that one of the voices had something to say. Opening her eyes, Madrone could see the energy of the room being stirred and swirled, changing. They waited as the speaker leaned his ear to the opening of Salmon's mouth and nodded. Friend Salmon says this. This matter concerns the waters. Human beings must survive to clean up the mess they've made. Well, that's helpful, another ferryman murmured. Does Friend Salmon have the ideas on how we do it? Survival is in the rivers of your blood. So is death, open to what you fear. Life and death swam together through the currents in the great domed room. What could Madrone open to? Fear was not what she felt, more a laden exhaustion, her eyelids too heavy to prop up. What did it all matter after all? Maybe they were all going to die, but the forces around them would remain. And why should she take advice from a fish that couldn't even speak comprehensibly? Was there some reason oracles had to be obscure? Diosa, she needed more sleep. Drone, there's a question directed at you. I'm sorry. I'm from the Defense Council, the woman said. She was an older woman, her straight hair a gleaming white over skin like wrinkled cream yellow parchment. With a start, Madrone realized she was looking at Lily Fong, one of the almost mythic Viejas. Madrone remembered her standing with an unpraised pickaxe on the day of the uprising, her face calm but alight. The muscles of her arms, old even then, bunching and tensing in her shoulders as she swung. This is what we do want to know, Lily said. Do you think this disease is a natural thing, or do you think it's a weapon? Madrone looked at her in surprise. You should know if anyone does. Lily was a listener, who rarely left the island and the lake in the center of the park, where the deep listeners maintained a constant protective vigil in the spirit world, alert for threats to the people. Couldn't they hear the answers to the questions? You mean as in biological warfare? The woman next to Madrone asked. That's what I mean. You work with these things directly, Madrone. We see only the reverberations in the chi worlds. I wish I knew. Madrone was tired. Tired. Did she really have to go around with this once again? We argue this one all the time in the Healers' Council. Actually, she argued it back and forth daily with herself. From the evidence of the computer models, some of us suspect it is engineered, but until we find it and analyze it, there's no real way of knowing. Does it matter? Of course it matters. How can we defend ourselves if we don't recognize an attack? Well, it's like this, Madrone went on. Essentially, we're living in a toxic stew. That was Nita's metaphor, and Sage and Holy Bear concurred. Don't let the flourishing of the gardens and the clarity of the waters delude you. There are still chemicals in the bay we may never be able to analyze, let alone neutralize. The atmosphere is suffering from an ozone depletion that won't begin to reverse itself for at least another 20 to 30 years, and that depends on what happened to the rainforests and the consumption of the fossil fuels in the rest of the planet, which we don't even know. There's low-level radiation left over from the last century, and who knows what's being pumped into the atmosphere now. And there were biological weapons developed years ago, and maybe some of them have been mutating ever since. Plus together, and it's not surprising we have reoccurring epidemics. If anything's surprising, it's that we're all doing as well as we are. What you're saying is that maybe we can't afford to continue our blessed isolation, said the woman from the transport collective. Madrone knew how eager they were to build a ship that could sail out beyond the confines of the bay and go exploring. It had come up time and time again. Not that council would stop them. It was just that nobody wanted to devote their scarce resources to the project yet. What she's saying is that we still aren't taking our toxin program seriously enough, said one of Nita's proteges from the Toxics Council. Let me speak for myself, Madrone snapped. I don't want to get caught up in political battles. The truth is, there are times when I've seen one of the viruses, and I can't deny that it looked to me like something constructed. And this one? The problem with this one is that we haven't been able to find it. Not with magic and not with a microscope. We aren't even sure if it is a virus. We believe it's a weapon, Lily Fong said, and we thought you should know that, possibly the forerunner of a direct assault. Complete silence fell over the group. Isn't it possible that the Defense Council, just by virtue of being concerned with defense, might have a bias towards seeing things in terms of attack? Cress from the Water Council pushed a hand through the thick black brush of his hair and stared straight at Lily. He reminded Madrone of a male dog asking for a fight. She expected to hear him growl. Lily drew herself up. We're not unaware of that possibility, young man. Don't you think we take that into account? All of us on the Defense Council are old, and we're all women, for that very reason. So that we'll be less likely to be led astray by our hormones or our paranoias. With all due respect for the members of the Defense Council, may I say even old women are not infallible. And weren't we going to review the policy this summer? Another man asked. How is it that the Defense Council is the only council allowed to be restricted by gender? Maybe when we fully recovered from the 5,000 years of patriarchy, when we can trust men enough to empower them for defense, the blonde woman said. And maybe we should argue that we need a few more generations to recover from thousands of years of racism before we let white people on defense, a dark-skinned man snapped back. A policy came from the voices, the woman retorted. The voices aren't infallible either. There's people under those masks, and some of them have their own agendas, Cress said. Are you trying to say, I'm saying we work by consensus, and that has to hold for the four sacred things as well, Cress said. Otherwise, it's meaningless. They can make suggestions, but I, for one, don't feel compelled to take orders from a bird or a fish or my great aunt in a coyote's mask. We have an obligation to think for ourselves. Why don't we all just shut up for a moment? Salal said forcefully. We're getting distracted by personal arguments. In the quiet, the speaker consulted with the deer mask. Friend Dear suggests we remember our connection to the earth. Dear says the earth is bigger than any one of us. There was silence. Some rebel in Madrone wanted to consider not her relationship to the earth, but to this council, her lack of patience with meetings and process, possibly stemming from her lack of sleep, or from her sense of urgency, her feelings that even as she sat there listening to arguments, people were dying. And it wasn't that the questions weren't important and the facilitation excellent, even if this conflict between defense and water had been going on for years. But it was important that she listened to it. But was it important that she listened to it? Or was she just impatient, trying to set herself up as a somehow special super healer, exempt from ordinary responsibilities? Friend Dear says, Madrone, beware the cold place. And what the hell does Friend Dear mean by that? She thought irritably. But she nodded her head in acknowledgement. Important issues have been raised here, Solace said. Clearly, there are some strong feelings in the council about the way defense has been set up, and maybe some questions about the voices, and we're giving over too much power to them. These are things we can't ignore. We can put them on the agenda later or next week, but right now, we're still talking about the epidemic, and I have to say that maybe none of us want to look it in the face. I don't. I'd much rather argue. This elicited mild laughter. But we've got to face it if we're going to survive. I wouldn't have brought this question of germ warfare here to the council if we hadn't examined it thoroughly, Lily said. Unfortunately, it is not just paranoia. If I were to share our paranoias, none of you would sleep again for a week. No, we believe it is a real possibility and one of fairly high probability. You believe, but how can we know? There was a stirring in the east. Speaker leaned to the mouth of the hawk. Bird knows, he said. The birds, Salal asked. That wasn't what Hawk said. Hawk said bird. Whose bird? There was a bird from our household, Madrone said. What was it with Bird lately? Like a haunting. He had become a presence who plagued her. He disappeared almost 10 years ago. We can't find him. Can Hawk? Hawk isn't saying any more, the speaker said. A wave of desolation hit Madrone. Just for a moment. She had allowed herself to hope that he had been found, that the voices of the listeners or somebody had made contact with him. And hope was wrong and dangerous, like allowing a little bit of atmosphere to seep into a vacuum, and then, when she felt it sucked out again, the hollow place it left seemed newly and sharply empty. Much to her own self-disgust, she began to cry. Several people moved to put their arms around her. The women beside her handed her a handkerchief. I'm sorry, Madrone said. I'm just tired. Ignore me. Healers' council meetings were usually always awash with tears, intercept with gallows humor, but she always hated people who cried in full council. It was so self-serving, but she couldn't seem to stop crying. Surya gathered Madrone up and hid her tear-stained face against her skinny shoulder. Oh, hell, Zalal said. We all want to cry. I do. Why don't we take a little break? And Madrone, why don't you go home and get some sleep? Madrone made great effort of will and raised her head. There's so much work to do, Madrone said. But it's my day to be here. Don't send her home, Lily said. She won't rest there. Go to the beach, young woman. Take some strength from the ocean. You'll do work better. That's a special request of the council, Salal said. Do we have consensus on that? Madrone stood outside the council hall looking west. From the high peaks she could see the ocean shining silver, invitingly. For one long moment she let herself feel the temptation to take council's advice, to duck out of work, catch the gondola west, and spend the day walking beside the rushing and retreating waves, filling her pockets with shells and stones. It had been too long since she spent a day like that. Bird was still in her mind. He had loved the water. When he was 14, he'd spent days and days windsurfing on the bay. She tried to keep up with him, but kept wiping out on the board, inhaling salt water, and Johanna had yelled at her about pollution and cancer. Suddenly she had a strong sensation of birds standing beside her, so physical she could almost have put an arm around his shoulder, let him lean on her. He seemed confused, in pain. It seemed to her that if she went to the beach, he would accompany her. They could walk beside each other, letting the waves wash their feet and lie on the sand, holding each other. She could almost hold him now, reaching out to gather in the sense of contact, transform it into breathing physicality. The golden dome of the council hall gleamed behind her. Her arm moved through the empty air. So that was chapter 3.